Hello everyone, my name is Gabby and this is what I've been thinking about lately. This is something new I'm doing. It's kind of a random vlog thing where I just sort of talk about whatever's been on my mind lately that I think other people will find interesting without necessarily having some kind of answer. Just sort of discussing without necessarily having a proper conclusion. I don't know if this is going to be like an ongoing series or if it's just like this one-off thing that I just feel like doing, but this is basically my chance to sort of do a video where I talk about things without necessarily having to like do a lot of sort of in-depth research and actually sort of like, really making sure I know 100% that I am an expert on what I am talking about. So what I'm thinking about this week, well, today I finally finished Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Or at the very least, not necessarily finished, but I finally beat the final boss in the Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. I know that might sound kind of strange. I mean, like everybody else probably kind of already beat this game like months ago, or beat the final boss months ago, or probably 100% of the game months ago. But for me personally, I've been doing a lot of kind of like sort of doing it in kind of like 1 hour, 2 hour blocks sort of like once a week. And I was still like exploring the world and stuff before I went around to fight Ganon. So I really didn't get around to actually like deciding to like legitimately go out and try to beat the game until like a few weeks ago. Breath of the Wild is a very good game. It is very well constructed, it has a lot to do in it, and it just has a lot of atmosphere to it. I really enjoyed playing it, although I'm not really sure if it's necessarily my favorite kind of Zelda game. In terms of my gameplay habits, I think I still am the kind of person who really kind of likes the sort of linear storytelling and linear gameplay, and sort of like, this is exactly how you're going to beat the game, and this is how you do it, as opposed to like this kind of stuff where it's like, you can beat things in any way you want, in any order you want, and with whatever tool you have available to you. Probably because I feel like linear games give you a much clearer kind of difficulty curve, and it also means that you can sort of experience things in the same way, so you're not ever really going to end up with something like an anti-climax or something is like too easy or too hard and you don't really know what to do. But one thing I particularly found engrossing about Breath of the Wild as I was playing through it was just kind of like the sort of feeling I had and the sort of motivation I had that made me keep wanting to like continue in the game and want to like sort of get to the end and beat Ganon and basically save Hyrule. I don't exactly know how the game did it, but it gave me an incredibly personal connection to everything that was happening in Hyrule and all of the characters, and it really made me want to see them succeed. In a lot of other kind of game stories that I've played, a lot of the time it kind of just feels like, you're kind of just sort of playing out a storybook. Like, the next chapter is always going to happen, the day is always going to be saved, everything is going to be alright, you're just sort of experiencing that story. You're reading the storybook, basically, as opposed to actually being a part of it. But in Breath of the Wild, just while I was exploring the game and exploring the game's world, I felt like I was much more of a kind of active participant in the story. I felt like I was personally trying to pretty much almost train myself and get stronger in order to defeat Calamity Ganon and also to save Princess Zelda. I've been trying to work out what exactly Breath of the Wild does that did give me that sort of personal connection, and I think it might have something to do with basically just sort of the landscape of Hyrule. The fact is, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild is basically almost a kind of post-apocalyptic adventure. It's kind of after the end. Calamity Ganon destroyed a lot of things 100 years ago, and you really see the aftermaths of that. There are so many ancient ruins and destroyed temples and destroyed cities and wagons. In practically every area of the game you see signs of damage. When you get to the main cities of the 4 main races, you see that they specifically are in trouble because of the divine beasts, and that is related to Ganon as well. And it's also tied into the gameplay. In Zora's Domain, everything is basically raining all the time. In Death Mountain, the mountain keeps erupting occasionally. I can't really remember much of what happened in the Gerudo Desert and the place where the Ritos lived, but maybe that was just because I personally never really ventured too far out into the Divine Beast territories there. But basically, the world of Hyrule is pretty much in distress, and it's been in distress for a very long time, and you've seen the signs of it, and you know why it's like that. In fact, that's the important part. You know why Hyrule is in distress, you know why everything turned out like this, and you know exactly what you have to do to be able to stop it. Calamity Ganon in Hyrule Castle, just go to Hyrule Castle, beat Ganon, and everyone will finally be able to rebuild. It makes the struggles of the world of Hyrule feel so much kind of more personal and sort of like also solvable. If you know that you can personally do one thing that will go and, cause all of this strife to stop. And that's not something that's in most post-apocalyptic worlds in general. Like, when you're in like a zombie apocalypse, there generally isn't like an immediate thing that you know is going to help cure all the zombies and get rid of the zombie apocalypse altogether. I mean, maybe that's a thing that can happen sometimes, but it's never really like as blatant and it's as obviously stated at the very beginning of the game like it is in Breath of the Wild. Another random thought I had while playing Breath of the Wild and getting to the end of Breath of the Wild, something that sort of made me think about game design, was just sort of the power of Calamity Ganon himself. And I don't mean power as in like, oh, how strong he is in terms of the game and how hard of a final boss he is and even how much he affects the story. It's more just like how much he affects the story and how powerful he is in the story by us basically not being shown him unless you go to Hyrule Castle and fight him yourself. Calamity Ganon is the main boss, the big thing that's behind all of the problems, all of the strife in this entire world, but you really don't ever see him unless you go to Hyrule Castle, unless you fight the final boss. See, the thing is, when I was getting ready to fight Calamity Ganon, well, I kind of had two feelings. The first feeling was kind of a sense of almost just sort of like relief, like everything I've been working towards, oh, it's finally going to be over. I'll finally be able to put all of this knowledge to the test and all of these skills to the test and finally basically will defeat this game. And the other thing was also kind of like a sense of sort of like apprehension. And I didn't really know what the apprehension was at first, but I think now what I think it might have been was basically apprehension of the unknown. Calamity Ganon's power, I think, his main power comes from the fact that he is unknown unless you fight him. Recently, I was reintroduced to a term in film studies that I had been familiar with before that's called the acousmetre. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And basically what the acousmetre is essentially a term that refers to pretty much a voice without a body. It's like a voice, but you don't know who the voice belongs to. And one of the sort of arguments about that sort of idea of the acousmetre is essentially that the idea that because the voice doesn't have a body and because you don't know where it comes from, it kind of gives the voice its own sort of powers. It means that it can sort of do things that most voices wouldn't be able to do. In particular, things like it has the illusion of being able to be everywhere and see everything and know things that you wouldn't necessarily expect it to know. And I think you can kind of apply that term to sort of talk about something like Calamity Ganon, or basically just a lot of sort of final bosses in open world games where you know the final boss is coming, but you don't know what the final boss is going to be like until you actually fight them. Maybe you could say that Calamity Ganon, until you fight the final boss, is essentially like a boss without a gameplay. That you know the boss is there, but you don't know what the gameplay is going to be, and because you don't know what the gameplay is going to be, you don't know how you're going to fight them, it kind of imbues that idea, imbues that boss with pretty much supernatural powers. Until you fight Ganon, it could be anything or anyone, and it could play in any multitude of ways, considering how many different gameplay styles Breath of the Wild has, and that's, I think, perhaps the reason as to why just the very concept of Calamity Ganon was just so gripping as a story element to let me keep going. On the one hand, I wanted to see what Calamity Ganon could do, but on the other hand, I almost kind of felt like I wanted to maintain the illusion of not knowing what Calamity Ganon could do, so that's kind of why I just sort of went out and explored the world without going to face the final boss, even though I could theoretically have done it whenever I wanted to. And another thing about the acousmetre, something that's interesting, is that, the moment that the acousmetre pretty much gets a body, the moment you know where it comes from or who it comes from, it pretty much loses all of its power. Because at that point, it's not this magical disembodied voice coming from nowhere, it is a voice that is coming from a clear person or a clear source. And I think that's the exact same thing that applies to Calamity Ganon, and I think that's part of the reason as to why people found the final boss kind of a bit of a disappointment. If Calamity Ganon's power comes from not being able to be fought, the moment you fight it, it basically, it stops becoming an overlying gameplay and story concept. It just becomes another boss. Something that you can do as many times as you want. Something where you can find optimum strategies. Something which you can overpower really quickly by spamming all your best moves at the same time. And maybe that's why people found the final boss in the ending of Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild kind of a little bit disappointing. Well, that and there probably weren't that many cutscenes after the end of the fight, and it didn't really feel like it could necessarily wrap up absolutely everything you've been doing in this massive massive game with a lot of different places in it, but that's another story. So basically, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild made me think a lot about game design. I don't know much about game design. I'm not a game designer. I've never even attempted or even researched game design before, but it was something that made me think. So at the end of the day, even though I honestly think I do prefer more linear games and even more linear Zelda games, I actually do appreciate that The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild was completely non-linear, because it did make me think about things and it took me out of my comfort zone, and because it took me out of my comfort zone, it did make me think about things that I wouldn't normally think about. So basically, no conclusions, just thoughts. Thoughts, a lot of thoughts. My brain is a giant sponge of random material that sometimes decides to invade my mind and tell me that I should make a video about it or something like that. If you like this format, tell me in the video description. And if you also have a lot of thoughts that take up your brain that might be related to Zelda or Dragon Ball or anime or anything, maybe put that in the comments section as well, because why not at this point, right? So this is Gabby, signing out, and goodbye guys.